Thanks very much, Xiaoli. To elaborate on the comments we heard a few minutes ago about critical evaluation for data science, we're delighted that the first technical session for this morning is going to be focused on a set of questions related to differential privacy in the 2020 census. And we'll start with a couple of comments about general context for this before we move on to the specific papers that we have for the session. First of all, it's worthwhile to bear in mind that the general context in which these classes of questions arose flowed from the dual mission that effectively all government statistical agencies have. First part of that dual mission is to deliver high-quality statistical information products and services, but to do it in a very specific way, almost always in the form of public goods, delivering those to a wide range of stakeholders, doing that on a sustainable and cost-effective basis, and also doing so within very important societal and legal constraints. And those constraints include privacy protection, which will be centered much of the discussion that we have this morning. Furthermore, those efforts that we have along that mission have a second component, which is that we're also charged with adapting and enhancing the statistical information products and services, and also the means by which we produce and deliver those products and services. We do that within the context of very dynamic societal, technological, and data environments. We're delighted especially to have a chance to have this discussion here within the Harvard Data Science Review and Harvard Data Science Institute setting. For this morning, we have two sessions on this topic, and the goals that we're going to be having is to talk about differential privacy specifically for the 2020 decennial census products. But to a very large degree, many of the lessons learned that we hope to obtain here also may apply to a lot of other data science activities that we have, and especially for other types of government statistics, products, and services we have from many different agencies. All of those agencies together are always having to balance a set of criteria. It's worthwhile to listen to all of our talks this morning and how they're going to be dealing with these criteria involving data quality and risk and cost. And the way in which we're trying to balance that work with data, quality, risk, and cost within a set of constraints that are defined by a very stringent legal and regulatory environment, and also a very complex ecosystem that has developed over the course of decades for data dissemination and for data use by a very wide range of intermediaries and stakeholders. And doing all that within a set of expectations and practice that have developed around the notion that almost all of our data should be in fact disseminated by way of, quote, public goods, unquote. We'll hear some more about that later on today. And to get some light shining on those areas, we're going to be spending a lot of time in the first session, especially talking about empirical results, and then both in the first session and also in the panel session that Erica Groshen is going to be leading, then talking about how do we interpret those results, and then how do we help take those initial results that we're seeing here and open a door for us to be able to learn more over the course of time, and doing that within this very dynamic societal, legal, and data environment that we're seeing. So we're absolutely delighted to have four papers in this first session. Michael Hawes and Phil Leclerc will be representing the Census Bureau in a moment. And then Quentin Brummet and co-authors from NORC will be giving first of three reports on some analyses related to the 1940 decennial data. They're being used as testbed for many of these ideas and methods. David Van Ripper will be following up with a second paper from IPUMS, and then Brad Hershbein and co-authors from Upjohn Institute will be finishing the session. We'll then have a short break, and then Erica Groshen will be leading a panel. So with that, we'll turn things over to Michael Hawes and Phil Leclerc.
Thank you, John. Good morning, everyone. I'd like to start by thanking Xiaoli and the Harvard Data Science Review for having us here today for this very important discussion. I'd also like to thank the organizers of today's event and the three research teams and the discussants who have put significant time and effort into making all of this possible. And finally, I want to thank the IPUMS team at the University of Minnesota for curating the 1940 census data that made all of this possible. Before we hear from the research teams, Philip and I wanted to give a brief overview of the Census Bureau's decision to modernize our disclosure avoidance methodologies for the decennial census, and then to give an overview of the design and architecture of our disclosure avoidance system. So the Census Bureau's commitment to privacy and confidentiality is absolutely critical to our ability to produce high-quality statistics about the nation's people and economy. Protecting the privacy of our respondents and the confidentiality of our respondents' data is both a legal requirement under Title 13 of the United States Code, and also it's a core element of our institutional culture. In an era of declining trust in government and with high-profile data breaches occurring with ever greater frequency, maintaining the quality and accuracy of our statistics would not be possible unless our respondents trust us to properly safeguard the information that they provide. And when we publish our data products, we can't merely consider the privacy risks and challenges of today. Our legal and ethical obligation to protect our respondents' privacy and confidentiality requires us to make sure that our data products are also properly protected against the privacy threats of tomorrow. Over the past century, the Census Bureau has been a world leader in the design and implementation of various statistical methods to safeguard data in public data releases. And as new privacy threats have been identified over the years, the Census Bureau has worked very diligently to improve our statistical safeguards to mitigate those emerging threats. Our adoption of differential privacy for the 2020 census is merely the latest step in a long history of innovation and continuous improvement in our privacy protections. And it's a necessary one to counter the 21st century privacy threats posed by the proliferation of external data and increasingly powerful algorithms that make re-identification of individuals in these public data products possible. I'm sure it comes as no surprise that every release of a calculation or tabulation from a confidential data source leaks a tiny amount of private information. The database reconstruction theorem demonstrates that if you publish too many statistics too accurately, eventually you will reveal the entire confidential source data. Now, the 2010 census, the 2010 decennial census, collected a mere handful of attributes for the approximately 309 million people in the United States. This gave us a total of about 1.9 billion confidential data points. But the 2010 census data products released over 150 billion statistics. And internal Census Bureau research has confirmed that the 2010 census confidential microdata can be accurately reconstructed from those publicly released statistics. In fact, using only a portion of the 2010 publicly available data, Census Bureau researchers were able to accurately reconstruct individual-level records for all 6 million inhabited blocks, census blocks, in the United States. Moreover, we were able to reconstruct detailed individual-level information, including sex, age within one year, race, and ethnicity for 71% of the entire US population. Linking those reconstructed records to commercially available data from 2010, we were then able to confirm accurate re-identifications for 52 million individuals. Now, an external attacker could easily replicate this attack. And then that attacker would then be able to learn those individuals' self-reported race and ethnicity. Though it should be noted that that attacker would have some uncertainty as to which re-identifications were in fact correct, and they would need to do some external fieldwork, some additional fieldwork to make those confirmations of those re-identifications. So recognizing the growing threat posed by the proliferation of external data and posed by these increasingly powerful data algorithms that can perform these reconstructions and re-identifications, the Census Bureau recognized that our traditional approaches to disclosure avoidance and protecting privacy in our public data products are increasingly insufficient. So to meet our continuing obligation to safeguard our respondents' information, the Census Bureau is committed to modernizing our approach to privacy protections and has adopted formal privacy for the 2020 decennial census. Now, traditional approaches to disclosure avoidance measure absolute privacy risk, but they require making certain assumptions about the resources that an external attacker would have at their disposal. And as our reconstruction and re-identification experiments have shown, it is often difficult, if not impossible, to predict in advance what resources an attacker might have in the future. In contrast with these traditional approaches, formal privacy allows us to measure privacy risk without needing to pre-specify an attacker model. Now, as I mentioned before, every statistic that you release derived from a confidential data source will leak a tiny amount of private information. Formal privacy allows us to set a mathematically provable upper bound on exactly how much private information will be leaked. Now, while traditional disclosure avoidance methods often require keeping the parameters of the methodology, like the swapping rate, and the impact of those methods on data accuracy secret, formal privacy aims to take privacy out of the darkness and into the light. The release of our disclosure avoidance system test is the most transparent view into the Census Bureau's privacy practices that has ever been released. We want this transparency to translate into constructive feedback from our data users, and our data users are everybody. We thus appreciate any and all feedback that we receive and are excited to translate that feedback into a better product for everyone in the country. So how do we facilitate a public test of our disclosure avoidance system? Well, first, we need to agree on a baseline for accuracy. Now, a thorough analysis of the disclosure avoidance system, the DAS, means baselining on data internal to the Census Bureau. For the 2010 census, that data is not public. But the 1940 census data is public. So now the public at large can make meaningful comparisons between the 1940 census data, both before and after application of the disclosure avoidance system. Now, a key aspect of differential privacy is that the privacy guarantees are interpretable. They're easily interpretable. And as my colleague Philip Leclerc will explain in a moment, a key feature of the disclosure avoidance system architecture is that various parameters of the system can be tuned to improve accuracy. However, there is no single way to measure or define accuracy. Every data user will want their own particular analysis or analyses to be accurate. But that can often come at the cost of accuracy for other uses. It's up to policymakers to choose the specific metrics that are going to be used to define accuracy in this context, and they often have to do so with a fairly broad brush. However, knowing what our data users expect in terms of accuracy can help us to optimize our disclosure avoidance system algorithms. Now, before I turn things over to Philip to explain the architecture of the disclosure avoidance system, it is critical to describe some of the limitations of our release of the code in connection with the 1940 census data. Those of you who are familiar with the 1940 census know that it asked a number of extra questions than were included in the 2010 census. There are questions on occupation, employment, and education, for example. However, the disclosure avoidance system test code only outputs those attributes that are contained in our 2018 end-to-end test. So if you want to analyze the impact of differential privacy on some of these other attributes or constructs, they could be added to this by editing the 2018 code base, but we leave it to you, the user community, to perform that assessment yourself. Now I'll turn things over to Philip to walk you through the disclosure avoidance system and its architecture and specifications. Thank you.
Thanks, Michael. Hello, everyone. My name is Philip Leclerc. I'm a member of the team working on the design of the top-down algorithm, which I will refer to as TDA throughout the remainder of this presentation. TDA is intended to be the principal formally private algorithm that we'll use in the production of the final 2020 decennial census. My goal over the next 10 minutes is to provide sort of the world's briefest primer to the key architectural design decisions and properties that are important in TDA. So at a very high level, unsurprisingly, TDA is just an algorithm. It takes in a set of inputs, it does the bulk of its processing, and it generates a set of outputs. What are the inputs? In this case, the two key inputs are first, the census edited file. This is the set of collected microdata in 2020 after edit and imputation has been performed. TDA takes this as sort of ground truth for what the microdata should look like before disclosure limitation is applied. The second important set of inputs that TDA will receive is a specification of a set of structural zeros. These are impossible record types that we need to tell TDA explicitly, you're not allowed to create records of this type. And in addition, a set of data-dependent invariants, which I'll say a little bit more about on the next slide, and we'll get to that in a moment. So given these two inputs, what does TDA do now? It enters its processing phase where it does its primary work. In the processing phase, the first thing TDA does is to take the Ceph, which is, as I said, formatted as a set of microdata records, and it converts those microdata records into an equivalent form as a histogram. A histogram is just a set of counts of different types with an integer reflecting how many records there were seen of that type. It's informationally equivalent to the underlying Ceph microdata, but it's more convenient for numerical computations. Now, given this histogram that is not yet privacy protected, we then pass that histogram through a differentially private subroutine. The differentially private algorithm is responsible for taking a noisy picture of this true underlying histogram. We take that noisy, now privacy protected copy of that histogram, we perform some more or less complicated mathematical optimization, and out the other side of the mathematical optimization pops a privacy protected version of the histogram, which we lastly convert into microdata. That microdata should be in the same schema as the inputs were received in, and it is then output to the tabulation group at Census to prepare the final publications. It might make this feel a little bit more concrete if we look at a simple example of a particular histogram that might be used in practice. So this is not the exact histogram that we will finally use, but it is reasonably close to what we can expect to work on and gives you a sense of scale. In this particular example, the histogram is built off of a schema that takes the Cartesian product of geography, ethnicity, race, age, sex, and HHGQ variables, where the HHGQ variable indicates whether a particular record resides in a housing unit or in a group quarters, and if in a group quarters, what type of group quarters. It's important to sort of look at this histogram object, which is a set of counts with different properties about them, and to look at the shape of it to get a sense of scale. So this particular histogram has a shape that is relatively lengthy and I won't read out, but it converts into something like 10 million, a shape of about 10 million by 1.25 million. Specifically, what that means is the 10 million is an order of magnitude stand-in for the number of geographic units, census geographic units across the country. And so for each of those roughly 10 million census geographic units, TDA is responsible for estimating given disclosure limitation noise, 1.25 million counts. So this gives you a rough sense of the scale at which TDA is intended to operate. Throughout the design of TDA, there are a number of properties we've insisted that are desirable and that we want to make sure TDA will respect. And so on this slide, I'm going to go through a few of those important properties. The first, as I promised a second ago, is that it needs to respect a set of data-dependent invariants. Data-dependent invariants are just properties of the true underlying data that we're not allowed to infuse noise into. So the final data should agree exactly on this set of data-dependent invariants with the underlying truth. The current set of data-dependent invariants that we're working with include grand state population totals, as well as two sets of invariants, a count of occupied group quarters facilities by census block and group quarters type, and a count of housing units by census block. It's important for me to emphasize that with these last two invariants, these are not invariants on the population counts of persons residing in these units or facilities. They are invariants on the counts of facilities or housing units themselves. These do imply some constraints on the final counts of person records, though. As an example, if you think about possibly a block that only contains a prison as a group quarters, no other group quarters, and no housing units, the implication of these invariants would be in that census block that TDA can only assign individuals to that prison. And so everyone in that census block would appear in a prison and not in some other kind of residence. The second property I'd like to discuss is referred to typically as epsilon consistency when we have conversations about it. Epsilon consistency is a pretty straightforward property. It just says that as the privacy loss budget, sort of the admissible amount of worst case privacy loss that will be allowed by the algorithm, is increased towards infinity, we should get the true data back again. This is a really important property because as the technical algorithm design team, it's not our job to prejudge what the policymakers at Census will choose for the final privacy loss budget. And so we want to make sure it's always possible for them to say, we actually need a bit more accuracy. This doesn't look good enough. And on the accuracy side of things, this enables them to be able to do that by always increasing epsilon so long as they're willing to accept the corresponding loss in privacy that is incremented from that. The third property I'd like to discuss is transparency. So I won't say too much about this because Michael covered it pretty well. Transparency is a key virtue of formally private methods, within which TDA is a particular example. In particular, we'd like to be able to release both the source code and the final parameter values that are chosen for the production run of TDA. That's sort of the goal throughout this process, and as Michael mentioned, we've already released the code that was used for the previous end-to-end test. The last property I'd like to discuss is a little bit more complicated than the others. Subject to the privacy constraint implied by a particular choice of epsilon, the goal and the design goal of TDA at that point is then to achieve as much accuracy as is possible on a pre-specified set of tabulations. You may read this bullet point and say, well, why don't you just try to get maximal accuracy on all possible tabulations? The reason this is a natural reaction, the reason for this, though, is that there are several theorems at this point in the formal privacy literature that establish against general classes of attackers and for arbitrary tabulations, you can't achieve both of those goals. So given that this is the case, how do we figure out which tabulations we're going to try and get good accuracy on? Our approach has been to focus on historically important data products, namely PL94171, which contains tabulations used for redistricting, as well as the demographic and housing characteristics file, which is the new name for the product that is intended to be the principal successor to summary file 1 from 2010. So we've talked a lot about properties and sort of at a high level what TDA looks like. Now let's talk a little bit more detail, an intermediate level of detail, how TDA is structured and sort of the behavior from which it gets its name. So TDA's first step, it just takes the overall privacy loss budget, epsilon, and it splits it into smaller epsilons corresponding to each of the individual geographic levels. For the first of those geographic levels, the nation, the point at which it starts, it generates using a DP subroutine a noisy picture of the histogram for the nation, and then it does mathematical optimization to generate microdata from that noisy privacy protected histogram. Now we move on to the state level. At the state level, we take the state privacy loss budget that's available, we spend it in each of the states, we get a noisy picture of the histogram in each of those states that's privacy protected, and then we do mathematical optimization again to generate microdata. But with one key change, which is now because we already have information about the national level distribution of counts, we require that the sum over the state level histograms will add up to the national level histogram. And that's really the key property of top-down. Moving top-down in this fashion forces the algorithm to reuse the information it's already generated at the higher level when generating histograms at lower levels. And really, that's the big idea behind TDA. That's the primary feature that makes it what it is. There's a lot of technical detail I'm alighting, but for the most part, we now just recursively walk down the hierarchy until eventually we've generated privacy-protected histograms at the census block level. So we've talked about how TDA is organized, but we should also talk a little bit about why TDA is organized in this way. Why did we choose to set things up in this manner? So really, if there's one thing you take away from a 10-minute presentation here, I think this is probably the most important thing. The key property that we were trying to achieve with TDA is that we want to make sure that the disclosure limitation error introduced by the TDA algorithm shouldn't increase for the tabulations in a geographic unit as the number of census blocks contained in that geographic unit are increased. This is really important because it means we can get increasing accuracy as the amount of observations in a geographic unit increases. This also strikes a stark contrast with sort of the obvious naive alternative algorithm, which would be to go sort of census block by census block and in each of them generate microdata and then add it together. If you do that, you tend to get accumulation of error. We can see this empirically if we look at some experiments that we had run historically. So this first example is on the 1940 census data. Instead of block by block, it will be district by district because enumeration districts were the lowest level of geography available. You can see in this first graph that accuracy and performance is roughly identical across all geographic levels. This is not a desirable property for an algorithm to have, and so we don't want to see this kind of behavior. If we look at TDA's performance on the same problem, we get a more natural graph. Here, because of the borrowing of strength from higher geographic levels and generating lower geographic levels, we actually see enumeration district performance is about the same as in the district by district example, but more importantly, we now see the improvement in performance you might expect as we move up to the higher geographic levels. It is important before I move on from this, and careful watchers of y-axes in the audience probably would have remarked upon this, the y-axis here lies between 0.94 and 1.0. It's been truncated pretty severely. That may cause you to say, well, okay, this property seems great, but if all of accuracy lies between 0.94 and 1, why do I care? That seems pretty good all over the place. And that's a reasonable reaction, but it's important to keep in mind that these properties generalize to settings where we have much larger histograms. This particular example was on a histogram of size about 2,000. The problem becomes a great deal more difficult when you step up to the 1.25 million size histogram we're actually working over. So having sort of laid out how TDA works, the key properties that we've tried to make sure that it will have, I'll close Michael and I's presentation by trying to touch on a few items that need to be resolved as we move into the final phases of the decennial census planning process. So the first of these is about the team I work on specifically. We're not done with development with TDA. We've released sort of development versions of the algorithm, but our intention is to continue to improve the algorithm, and we have a few specific plans for ways in which we're trying to improve it as we come up to sort of the completion of this process. And feedback from you all about particular features you've seen in the development data or particular use cases that are important to you can be a really important part of this process. I'm now going to jump really quickly to the last bullet point on this slide. So the last bullet point is about a decision that is up to the policymakers at Census. So we need the relevant policy decision-making board at Census to decide what the final set of invariants will be for TDA to operate. However, this, despite being a policy decision, is significantly constrained by technical considerations. There are two key classes here. First, the nature of the privacy guarantee, sort of the meaning of achieving a particular epsilon in terms of privacy protection, actually changes and weakens as you add more of these data-dependent invariants into TDA. And second, and maybe more worryingly even, as we add more data-dependent invariants, it can be very quickly to accidentally create a computational problem that is intractable and not solvable. So the last thing I'd like to touch on here is similar to the issue of the situation with invariants. Maybe the single most important decision that needs to be made is we need the relevant census decision makers, the policymaking board, to choose the final total privacy loss budget that will be used for TDA in its final production run. And in addition, to choose the way in which that privacy loss budget will be split up amongst competing tabulations. And to some extent between geographic levels, although that will have to be heavily informed by our empirical analyses because of the properties of TDA. And so I think our hope, or at the very least my hope, is that symposia like this and structured conversation with groups like you all will help us to do as well as we can in making the feedback we need be provided to the relevant decision makers about these kinds of decisions that are still outstanding. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much to Michael and, excuse me, thanks very much to both Michael and Phil. And we're now delighted to have the first of 3 presentations on empirical studies based on the 1940 decennial census with Quentin Brummet and his co-authors.
All right. Thank you, John. It's a pleasure to be here. Good morning to everyone. Delighted to talk about work we've been doing looking at the potential effects of differential privacy on sampling operations for sample surveys and potential funding allocations. So as was laid out in the talks by Census, there are a lot of worries that computational advances and the growing availability of data can make the identification of respondents possible when it might not have been before. And differential privacy and the methods that are being used provide strong approval privacy guarantees, but there are a number of decisions to be made along the way, and how differential privacy is applied, including the global epsilon that we've been discussing, and I'll discuss in detail today, depends both on privacy and on data utility. And I think while there's been a significant amount of discussion about privacy in the 2020 census, to my knowledge at least, this is kind of the first systematic dig in on the utility side of this trade-off and what differential privacy might mean. And so grateful to Xiaoli and Erica and everyone for putting this together. So what we're going to do is use the 1940 data that was just introduced and look at what the DP-based noise injection, how that changes 3 separate use cases. So we're gonna, Census has released 8 different values of epsilon, and there are 4 runs of the differential privacy value for each epsilon. 4 runs of the algorithm for each epsilon. Our 3 use cases, our first 2 will come from survey operations. So NORC alone, for instance, has over 200 survey projects in a given year. A large number of these are very reliant on census data for many parts of the operation. We're going to consider 2 particular use cases in specific. First is creating an oversample of African Americans in an existing survey. And the second is constructing a survey frame to survey a very rare population. And then our final use case will look at funding allocations and how the differentially private noise that gets added might change a hypothetical funding allocation example. What we're going to find is, on average, the differentially private data is very close to the truth, and this is especially true for large geographic areas. And when we use the differentially private data in the context of oversampling the African American population, this is a very relatively large subgroup, and the data performs very similarly to what happens with the underlying data. But when we want to target a survey at a relatively rare subgroup, we're going to consider our specific example will be the adult American Indian Alaskan Native population. It can be difficult to construct an accurate sampling frame unless epsilon is relatively high. So high epsilon is low noise. I anticipate all the speakers will continue to just refer to epsilon as we've thought about this a lot, but if you're new to the subject, that's... and then for our funding allocation use case, we're going to find that the funding allocations are correct on average, but again, with low epsilons, there can be a lot of noise and potentially severe misallocations, at least for small geographic areas. Before I get into the results, I want to note three, I think, fairly important limitations. The first one was noted already by some of my colleagues at Census, in that the 1940 noise-injected data contains a relatively limited set of variables. So I think there are a number of use cases that are relevant for the 2020 context that we're not going to cover here. Second, I think importantly, the privacy budget will likely be spread over more statistics in 2020. I think both the tables that are constructed as well as the number of geographies that they're constructed over will be different in the 2020 census compared to what is in this 1940 data. So I don't think that the epsilons will translate over perfectly from 1940 to 2020. And third, the geography is different as well. So the smallest geographic unit we have to use is the enumeration district. These are roughly the size of a census block group, but they are constructed in different ways, and we don't have the kind of modern geographic boundaries such as census tracts in the 1940 data. So that's a little bit of a limitation as well. So to start with our oversampling example, I've kind of listed some of the specifications here, but the basic idea is that in the context of a hypothetical survey, we're going to consider trying to sample African American individuals at twice the rate of other individuals. We do this in order to achieve a larger sample so that we can make more precise inferences on this group. And then assuming no non-response, so we get perfect response for everyone we talk to, we're going to look at the sample composition and how many interviews we need to make to achieve a 1,000 person African American sample using both the differentially private data as well as the underlying data. So this shows the results. The red line shows the number of interviews that we would need to run on the true underlying data, and the connected blue line shows the number of interviews using the differentially private data for different epsilons. And so you can see when epsilon is very low, there is a bit of a gap there, but it's still relatively small. And then as epsilon gets bigger and goes to 2, 4, 6, and 8, you can see there's almost no difference between the results from the differentially private data and the results from. This is only for run 1 of the differentially private algorithm. So Census has released 4 different runs. If I look across all 4 runs, the results still look relatively similar. For relatively low values of epsilon, maybe there's a small difference, but I don't think that this, the run-to-run variation is causing too much of a concern here. So on the whole, the noise injection from differential privacy here has little effect on our ability to oversample African Americans, at least, especially for large epsilons. And this is largely driven by the fact that it's a relatively large minority group. And so what we're going to consider next is a relatively rare population. And in particular, we're going to consider a survey where we want to target a survey. Consider a survey targeting the adult American Indian Alaskan Native individuals. So this is AIN. We're going to restrict to enumeration districts of greater than 0 AIN population. And then again, we're going to divide into 2 strata, and we're going to sample individuals living in this high AIN area at 5 times the rate. And so very similar to what I showed before, we're going to ask the question of if we have perfect response to our screening operation, how many screeners will we need to achieve a 1,000 person sample? Again, this is a very similar graph where the red line shows the results using the true data, and the blue line, connected line, shows the results with differentially private data for different values of epsilon. And here you can see that for at least low levels of epsilon, there is a bit of a difference. So with epsilon of around 0.25, this translates to roughly a 10% increase in survey costs due to this additional screening effort. As epsilon increases, though, it's pretty modest. So as we get to epsilon of 2, 4, 6, and 8, as you can see, the lines are closing in on each other, and there isn't as much of a difference. Again, if I do this for all 4 runs, the results look very similar, so there isn't much run-to-run variation here. And what's happening is that our survey operation really relies on being able to target areas that have a certain percentage of AINs in them. And so here we show a scatter plot of the true percentage AIN and the percentage AIN in the differentially private data for epsilon 0.25 and epsilon of 8. And so you can see with epsilon 0.25, there's a significant amount of dispersion around this red line, the 45-degree line, whereas with epsilon of 8, it's relatively tighter. This is in the low density strata, so the strata with less than 30% AIN. If we go to the high density stratum, you can see a very similar pattern. So epsilon 0.25, there's a lot of dispersion around this line, whereas with epsilon of 8, it's relatively tight. One other thing to note about this is that these dots are weighted by total population size, and you can see that the dots that are a little bit larger tend to be closer to this 45-degree line and a bit more accurate. So all in all, the effect on the number of screeners and this relatively increase in survey costs is still somewhat modest, at least for larger values of epsilon. So for instance, for epsilon greater than 1, this translates to on the order of magnitude of 1 to 2% increase in survey costs, which if this was a $10 million survey might still be $100,000 or $200,000, so it's not no money, but it's at least relatively modest. But I think the issue that's hiding here is that because we only consider areas with greater than 0 population, there are many areas where the differentially private noise causes places where you actually do have adult AIN individuals to appear that there are none. And our survey will not consider that in the sampling frame. So the real question is, how much of the adult AIN population are we losing? So this graph shows the coverage of our sampling frame of this population. And you can see with epsilon 0.25, our coverage is only 70%. So 30% of adult AIN individuals are not even eligible to be sampled. So this could result in severe undercoverage and potentially severe bias in the resulting survey estimates. It gets better as epsilon increases. By the time epsilon is 8, the coverage is roughly 97%. While the effects of the noise injection are relatively minor for survey operations in terms of added efficiency, for low levels of epsilon, there can be pretty severe coverage issues. And this is always an issue with oversampling designs, but is for certain exacerbated by the differentially private noise. And one side note here is that in theory, one could construct a 0% strata and go to every location to try to screen, but that would result in orders of magnitude increase in survey costs, and so it would be infeasible. And we've performed these similar results across a few different versions of oversampling designs and sizes of enumeration districts, and the results are qualitatively similar. So now I want to switch gears and move away from the survey sample design and talk a little bit about a hypothetical funding allocation and what differentially private noise would mean in that context. So our hypothetical funding allocation assumes a budget of $5 billion that we're going to allocate nationwide to, on the basis of the number of individuals who are less than 18 years old. So this works out to roughly $125 a child. And then we're just going to ask, what's the distribution of misallocated funds across both enumeration districts and counties? And here's somewhere where I think it's worth including the caveat again, that these are not modern geographical definitions. And so this is very much a hypothetical example because enumeration districts don't reflect the sorts of geographic areas that get funding allocations using census data in modern times. But the results for enumeration districts show that when epsilon is small and there's a lot of noise, there can be potentially extremely severe misallocation. So for instance, with epsilon 0.25, this is the 10th and 90th percentile of misallocation. So about 20% of enumeration districts have a misallocation that's greater than about 44%. With epsilon of 1, moving about to the middle of the range here, the 20% of enumeration districts still have at least a 12 to 13% misallocation to either side. By the time we get to epsilon of 8, the misallocation is much smaller, but is still about 20% of enumeration districts have misallocation about 3% or more. Could show this graphically as well, where you can see that with epsilon of 0.25, there's quite a large spread, including a peak towards the left of the graph where the differentially private noise has zeroed out the district and all of their funding allocation has disappeared. As epsilon moves to 1, 4, and 8, again, the distribution tightens up very close around 0, and there's relatively minor misallocation. If we look at counties, the misallocation, even for epsilon 0.25, is smaller than the epsilon of 8 misallocation for enumeration districts, so it's significantly better. So here with epsilon 0.25, 20% of counties would have at least a 2.5% misallocation. And as we go up to epsilon of 8, the results are getting even better. So in general, with low values of epsilon, there can be pretty severe per child misallocation to enumeration districts, but for counties, it's actually pretty good across the range of epsilons. I think in practice, and a question for future research, especially that has access to more modern geographical definitions, is whether even these minimal misallocations are something that would be a concern in policy and practice. So before wrapping up, I want to just say one little bit about privacy. I've talked a lot about the utility side of this trade-off, but obviously the choice of epsilon depends a lot on both the utility and the privacy concerns. And so I think one thing that's worth thinking about is that the choice of epsilon might depend on the damage that is done by disclosing particular characteristics. In particular, for the Census 2020, a lot of characteristics such as age, race, sex, and home ownership are pose relatively less harm and might be even publicly available already, whereas information such as a citizenship special tabulation might be considered extremely sensitive. And it's worth noting that this isn't just for consideration for the global epsilon, but there are a number of policy decisions along the way about how the tables that are protected get constructed and how epsilon is split among the tables and geographies that could potentially impact the relative noise that gets added to these different characteristics. And so it's important to kind of keep in mind the relative benefits and the potential costs of some of these potential areas. So in conclusion, just to wrap up, for larger groups and geographic areas, the differentially private data perform very similarly to what we see with the underlying data, but for rarer subpopulations, there's some cause for concern. So we see with low values of epsilon, the differentially private data can prevent surveys from covering the entire population, which could lead to severe bias. And it could also lead to severe misallocation of funds, at least for the small geographic areas as represented by enumeration districts. And so the choice of epsilon and these other implementation details are going to require careful analysis of privacy and utility. And again, I thank Xiaoli and Erica and everyone for putting this together so that we can do that.
Thanks very much, Quentin. And our next speaker is David Van Ripper, and he will be presenting work with himself and his colleagues.
Thank you. Thanks everybody for coming. I want to thank Xiaoli and Erica for having us present here. And today I want to first thank my collaborators on this project, Tracy Kugler, Jonathan Schrader, Jose Pacas, and Steve Ruggles, who all provided useful feedback on the work that I'm about to present. Of course, any errors I make today are mine and mine alone. I also want to thank the Census Bureau for publishing their code and to the user community so we can actually test it and see what kind of impact it has on the output data. And I want to thank Phil, Leclerc, and Simpson Garfinkel for answering some of my fairly naive questions as I started out on this journey and getting feedback that helped inform the work that you're about to see. So today we're going to look at the analysis of differential privacy noise injection on the measurement of racial residential segregation. So why should we care about that particular topic? Well, if you look at a quick Google Scholar search, there's been 7,000 citations published since the beginning of 2018 that tackle this important social topic and social problem that we face in this country. And it's also a commonly used use case for decennial census data. So segregation is often measured using decennial census data. So I thought this made it an excellent use case for looking at the impact of noise injection. My focus today is really on that allocation of epsilon. So I'm not going to get into the magnitude of epsilon, but I want to look at how epsilon is allocated to tables and geographic levels and see how the measurement of residential segregation changes depending on how you change that allocation. Key takeaways for today include the significance of that epsilon allocation. And these are the two of the important policy decisions that Census has to make thinking about the 2020 decennial. And I also want to I'll point out in the end that racially homogeneous geographic units are most impacted by this noise injection. So that you're going to get the addition of non-white persons into fairly white counties, and that's going to really potentially change the magnitude of the segregation that's computed. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the data sets that I created to do this analysis. We use 8 different allocations for this project, which can be assigned into 3 groups. So the DAS group contains 1 allocation, and that was taken from the data that was published by Census in June of 2019. The geographic level group consists of 4 allocations, and the query group contains 3 allocations, and I'll talk about those in detail in just a second. We executed the Census Bureau's DAS software in an Amazon server, and that uses the top-down algorithm that Philip explained earlier, 4 times for each allocation. So we ended up with 32 different runs of the software, 4 times for each of 8 allocations. And we compare those output to the ground truth, or the IPUMS data. The IPUMS data are the input to the Census DAS software. So it's the most appropriate comparison group that we have. So the first decision was, what's the privacy loss budget? What's the global epsilon going to be for the runs? The Census Bureau's June release had 8 different values of epsilon. For my analysis, I decided just to set the privacy loss budget to 1. It just made, there's no reason behind it. I just thought it would be an easy thing to think about the math. So for the GeoLev allocations, I chose a epsilon of 1, and I did the same thing for the query. The results that I'm going to talk about today really come from comparing the Census DAS run of 1 with the GeoLev and the query allocations all set to 1. So most of the results you'll see today are those comparisons. The second thing I had to decide on is what was the allocation of epsilon across geographic levels. So in the 1940 census data, we have 4 geographic levels. We have nation, state, county, and enumeration district. The DAS run from June uses an even split among those geographic levels, so 0.25 to each geo level. For the geographic level group, we created 4 different allocations, and in each one, we assigned a bulk of that privacy loss budget to a single geographic level, and a small portion to the remaining 3 levels. So I really pulled on the extremes. I really wanted to see, if I set these things really high for one and very low for the others, what does the most extreme case look like? In the plots that you'll see later on, you'll see labels such as nation, state, county, and enum dist. That label indicates the geographic level that received that 0.85 of the privacy loss budget. So that's the level that received the bulk of the privacy loss budget. For the query group, I chose the same even split among all the geographic levels, so I set that to 0.25. The final policy decision that we had to make was how to allocate the privacy loss budget to the queries that were defined in the 1940 Census DAS software. And they have 3 queries that they have predefined in the code. They have a voting age by Hispanic by race table, they have a household group quarters table, and they have the detailed table, which is the fully saturated histogram of voting age by Hispanic, by race, by household group quarters status. The June DAS data uses this allocation of 0.675 to VHR, 0.225 to household group quarters, and 0.1 to detailed. I chose the same allocation for my GeoLevel group so that I wanted some points of comparison among all of these, so I set it the same for the GeoLev. And then for the query allocations, I again pulled on that extreme. So I created 3 allocations, and we assigned a bulk of the privacy loss budget to one of those queries and a small portion to the other. And again, the label on the plots indicate which query received the bulk of the privacy loss budget. So this is to help you understand kind of what you're going to be seeing in a few minutes. In the end, we have 4 runs of these 8 different DP allocations. 1 from the census, 3 from the query, and 4 from the geographic level allocations. And these are the comparisons that I'm about to show you stem from these different allocations. After creating the data sets, I calculated two segregation metrics, the index of dissimilarity, which is also known as D, and the isolation index, which is also known as B, for all counties in the data sets. And then I computed the segregation metrics for the counties in the IPUMS 1940 data, so I had a comparison group to look against. And these calculations form the basis of the results you'll see in a few minutes. These segregation metrics are measured at the county level. You essentially compare the enumeration district counts or proportions with their county equivalents, and you use those comparisons to compute the segregation metrics. So on the plots that I'll show you, you're going to see a whole lot of dots. There's 3,108 dots. Each of those dots is a segregation computation for a county. Just to give you a little bit of detail about these metrics, Massey and Denton classified D as a measure of evenness. Essentially, do enumeration districts look similar? The population composition of enumeration districts looks similar to the counties that they fall within. So if there's a deviation at the enumeration district level and the county level, D will increase. If they're the same, D will be lower. D ranges from 0 to 1. Lower values indicate less segregation. Higher values indicate more segregation. D is 0 if the EDs have the exact same population composition as the county. D will be 1 if EDs contain population from only one subgroup. One thing to note about this metric, it's invariant to the relative sizes of the population. So B is not, and that shows up in the plots, and you'll kind of see what happens when you have an invariant versus a variant. Looking at the formula, WI is the count of whites in the enumeration district I. W county is the count of whites in county containing I. NWI is the count of non-whites. So I've grouped together all non-white races in 1940, which is American Indians, African Americans, Asians, and what was that? AAN, yeah, American. I've thought about this for so long, it's all a jumble in my head sometimes. And then NWI is the count for non-whites in the enumeration district, and NW county is the non-white count for the county. Now, if you look at isolation, Massey and Denton classify this as a measure of exposure. Isolation essentially measures the probability that a minority group member shares a unit with another minority person. Like D, this metric ranges from 0 to 1, with lower values, again, indicating less segregation, and higher values indicating more segregation. B is sensitive to the size of the majority and minority populations. It tends to be lower when the minority group population is small and increases as that minority group population grows. Again, looking at the formula, NWI is the non-white count for enumeration district I. Non-white county is exactly what it means. The key thing here is on the right-hand side, we're taking the proportion of the total population in an enumeration district that is non-white. You take these fractions, you multiply them together, and you sum them for all EDs in a county. Okay, let's look at some results. So the first thing we're going to look at is the allocation of epsilon to different fractions, and what does that look like looking at bias in some of these metrics. But before we do that, I want to start with actually a plot that is not based on the results, on the data that I just ran. I want to orient you to the plots that you're about to see. So this slide here compares the D values calculated from the June Census Bureau data. Each plot here it uses a different value of epsilon. So we have 0.25 in the upper left corner, down to 8 in the lower right-hand corner. And the color here, the dots that are blue, are counties whose minority population comprise less than 10% of the total population of the county. So these are relatively homogeneous and mostly white counties. The red dots are counties that have a minority population that exceeds 10% of the total population count. And you see different patterns depending on those proportions, and we'll look at that here in a second. If we look at the epsilon of 0.25, we see a positive upward bias in D. The differentially private data indicate higher levels of segregation than we observe in IPUMS, and this is especially true for those counties with a small minority population percentage. As epsilon increases, the point cloud shifts down and right, so that we see a negative bias by the time we're at epsilon of 8. Now the DP data indicate lower levels of segregation than was observed in IPUMS. So before I go on, I want to just talk through that intuition in just a second. To do so, I've made a fake county that consists of 9 different enumeration districts. This county contains 15 non-whites spread over these 9 EDs, and D for this county is 0.556. For epsilon of 0.25, we're going to be drawing noise from a fairly wide geometric distribution, right? It's going to be a noisy count that we're going to be drawing from this distribution and adding to those ED counts. And we have a higher probability of drawing relatively large random values from this distribution. So we see that we go from 5 0 cells to 6 0 cells, and some of those counts get pretty high, right? We've gone from 0 to 18, 17 to, and 3 to 17, and 2 to 12. Now what we actually do here is first we draw a count for the county. So we increase the count of non-whites in the county from 15 to 28. We then do random draws for the EDs, and the final thing we do is scale those ED counts so that they sum to that noisy count of 28. Now we have a D of 0.7, so we've increased D by like 16 percentage points. And what's happening here? We're drawing these large values, we're sending a lot of smallish counts to 0, and we're ending up with fairly large counts where we used to have small counts. So that's where we're kind of really pulling on these extremes and seeing D grow. So what happens on low values of epsilon? Here we're drawing noise from a narrow geometric distribution. So we're going to get a higher probability of drawing fairly low counts, 1s, 2s, 3s. We compute a noisy county count of 16. So we've gone from 15 to 16, so that county count barely changed. And then drawing the noise at the ED level, we end up with, instead of 5 zeros, we have 4. And we have 5 EDs with positive counts. And to me, it almost seems like we're just kind of spreading out the non-whites among different EDs in the county. And what you end up with then is a D value that's now dropped by 11 percentage points. We've gone from 0.5 down to 0.4. And I think that's where we're seeing some of these kind of, depending on what that epsilon is and what the distribution is within counties, we're seeing sometimes positive upward bias, sometimes negative upward bias. Now, I'm not going to talk about epsilon's magnitude anymore today, but I wanted to kind of look at that and provide a little bit of intuition. But now we're going to go into the meat of the comparisons. So this is the mean index of dissimilarity. The epsilon is 1 for all of these plots, and each panel is a different, so it's a mean over 4 runs. I computed D for each run, and I took the means of them for each county. Each panel is essentially indicates what received the bulk of the privacy loss budget. So along the top row, those are our geographic levels. So each of those received 0.85 of the privacy loss budget. On the lower row, we've got varying query allocations. So the query privacy loss budget changing. Now, nation, state, and county allocations actually produce fairly similar distributions to one another, all showing a positive upward bias for D. The enumeration district allocation, on the other hand, produces a noticeable downward bias in D for those counties with the minority percentage less than 10. On the bottom row, the geographic allocation is the same. Distributions for the DAS, the detailed, and the VHR allocations are actually quite similar. And this actually makes sense given that the query, there's actually not that much difference in the privacy loss budget allocation. The DAS uses 0.675 to detailed, or to VHR, and we're going up to 0.9 for the VHR. There's not that big of a difference. The household group quarters allocation, though, produces a very, very different result. So what's going on there? The race variable is receiving essentially no protection from noise. So we're adding a ton of noise into that race variable compared to the other 3. And so protecting household group quarters a lot is going to lead to very poor results for residential segregation. On the flip side, which are results I don't have, it's really good for total population. You get really good accuracy at the total population route for that particular allocation, but for this particular use case, it doesn't work out quite as well. Now let's take a look at these on their own. So I'm only showing you the counties with a small minority percentage, and this just helps you see what some of those distributions look like. Again, we can see that upward bias for nation, state, and county, and that downward bias for the ED level. These are just the counties with greater than 10% minority population. Now, the enum dist, DAS, detailed, and voting age Hispanic race actually have very similar distributions for the D values for these. The nation, state, and county have slightly more dispersion around that identity line. And again, the household group quarters results are almost a curvilinear relationship as D increases. And I actually don't quite know what's going on there. All I know is it's probably not a good result. Okay, so now we're going to look at the mean isolation of B. So this is the 8 allocations for B. So now you see where B is affected by the small population sizes. So you see that clustering of blue dots near 0. That's where you see that a lot of those counties just have small counts, and so their Bs are just going to be small. The red dots tend to be spread out among the whole axis. That because they have a larger count, they're not their B values tend to be higher. If we look at just the small minority population counts, we actually see a fairly similar distribution among all of these different allocations. The nation, state, county, and household group quarters kind of have the same dispersion around that identity line. Enum, dist, DAS, detailed, and the voting age Hispanic race have very similar looking allocations. And the same pattern really holds for the counties that have greater than 10%. Okay, so the scatter plots depict the joint distribution of the differentially private and IPUMS-based metrics, but they don't really depict what happens for individual counties, right? What happens when you actually look at how the results vary for a given county. And so now I'm going to show you some state-based plots where I plot the values of the different Ds and Bs for given counties and compare them to IPUMS. And I've chosen 3 states for very, very specific reasons. These states have non-white percentages in 1940 that closely match the 2010 non-white percentages for the 17th, 50th, and 83rd percentile states. So what I did is I divided the 2010 states into tertiles, and I took the medians of those tertiles, and then I identified in the 1940 data which counties had a similar non-white percentage. So what you're going to be looking at today is Arkansas has a 1940 non-white percentage, which is 24, that matches the median in 2010. Oklahoma's 1940 percentage, which is 10%, matches the median of the lowest tertile in 2010. And Alabama's percentage of 34% is closest to the median of the upper tertile in 2010. So here's the plot of the index of dissimilarity for Arkansas. Each column here represents a single Arkansas county. The red dot is the value of D that was computed from IPUMS, and the blue dots are values of D computed from the differentially private data. So each blue dot is a different allocation. And the counties here are sorted by their minority proportion. Counties with the largest minority proportion are on your left side, and moving right, we're going to get a decline in that minority population. Now, one thing I want to just flip back and forth here is that this is a dot plot for a single run. So I wanted to show you what would happen if we just get, because my assumption is in 2020, we're going to get one run of the code. We're going to get one set of data. So you will probably get some outliers in that run that could happen. So this is for one run. If we show the means, you'll see kind of how those blue dots move around a little bit as the mean essentially compresses a little bit. But you still see cases where the IPUMS value is quite a bit higher than any of the allocations that we presented. We have cases where the allocations create almost a barbell effect, where we have clumps of dots in one part of the plot, and there's another clump of dots in another part of the plot, and the IPUMS value may be in one of those two groupings, or it might be somewhere totally different. But this just lets you see what that dispersion looks like. Now, it's important to know that as we move to the left, you'll see that dispersion grow. So as the minority proportion decreases, the dispersion in D increases. So the spread between the maximum and minimum values of D is getting bigger as we move to the right, showing that for those low minority counties, as we're infusing noise into those enumeration districts, that noise infusion is then really impacting the measurement of D for these counties. One thing to know, so you may wonder why there's no red dots in the right-hand side. Those are counties that had no non-whites in them in the IPUMS data. So in 1940, those counties were 100% white. The noise infusion is adding non-whites to that county, and you are getting values of D for those counties where there was no value in the past. The other thing to notice, in case you're wondering, is all those low values on the right-hand side. Those are all the ED allocation. So those values here that are kind of really below the plots, those are all for enumeration district. This is what it looks like for B. Same pattern holds. Dispersion grows as the minority proportion increases. B is just a tighter spread in all cases, just because of the population size. Now I want to look at those other two counties that we looked at, Oklahoma and Alabama. So if we go to Oklahoma, and this should not be a surprise, it has a lower proportion of minorities as is. The dispersion for D for different allocations is just higher in general because those counties have smaller minority populations in them already. And if we look at Alabama, which is a more diverse state in 1940, we just observe that smaller amount of dispersion for any given county in the data set. Okay. So to conclude, I hope this presentation has convinced you of these two conclusions. First, for segregation analysis, the allocation of epsilon can have a major impact on the measurement of these segregation metrics. And stepping back a bit and looking at the bigger picture, the Census Bureau has a lot of decisions to make regarding that epsilon allocation. And they have to balance a ton of competing interests and use cases, from funding formulas to school district planning, to redistricting, to environmental risk assessment, to public safety provision, to program evaluation, to public health. My example is fairly simple. 4 geography levels, 3 queries. The 2020 census is going to have probably more than 70 geographic levels and 150 tables over which epsilon is going to have to be allocated. And the results of that allocation are going to have impacts on data users, and how we have these conversations is going to be really helpful, I think, for informing that decision-making process. And finally, kind of showing how racially homogeneous geographic units, that dispersion that we were seeing, especially in those plots at the end, the noise injection is going to potentially have impacts on the measurement of, particularly of racial segregation, but it's going to have impacts for lots of other potential use cases, and getting at what those are is an important thing moving forward. Thank you.
Thanks very much, David. And our final paper for this first session is going to be presented by Brad Hershbein, some work that he and his colleagues at the Upjohn Institute have done.
Thank you, John, and I want to echo my preceding presenters and thanking everyone else who was responsible for making today possible. I especially want to thank David for going through many of the things that I'm also going to go through and save me time, because I think I have about 7 minutes. I may be a little bit more than that, but I'll try to go relatively quickly. This is joint work with my colleagues at the Upjohn Institute. We're also going to be looking at the effects of the DAS system as opposed on the census release of 1940 on population counts and measures of segregation. And so we've laid a lot of the groundwork, so I'm going to try to go through this a little bit quickly. But one of the things that's been discussed thus far is that many things we have been about the tabular data, these aggregates. Phil talked about the histograms that get produced that have, in this case, roughly six dimensions. But as social science researchers, what we're particularly interested in are the full microdata and the ability to create joint relationships among dozens, if not hundreds, in some cases, thousands of variables. And when you start getting to those number of permutations, it gets way too large to actually produce a differential privacy run. Maybe if you believe Google has solved the quantum computing problem, we may be closer, but for now, we're still not there. And so, as has been echoed, there's a lot of concern about what this is going to mean when we start looking at relationships among variables for which the DAS system was not built. And so I'm going to go through a lot of this pretty quickly. It's been said a lot in most cases, but I just want to give you a sense of this epsilon parameter, this measuring the global privacy budget. The basic idea is that if epsilon gets really large, you can always differentiate two different data sets. As epsilon goes to 0, you have far less ability. You can always, as epsilon goes to 0, it doesn't really matter what you put into it, you will get the same thing out. And that's basically what that inequality is saying up there. However, there's been some concerns expressed by some people in this room that this sort of application may not make sense beyond just the 2020 census, but for certain microdata products that the census puts out, particularly the American Community Survey, which is an annual sample that has far more detail in it than the census. But because that is already a sample and because there are already protections built into it, and also it's not clear how the existing DAS algorithm is not built for the microdata. It is built for the certain amount of aggregates that could get put out. It was already mentioned how many billion data points that includes. There's a lot just in the aggregate data. When you start considering all the possibilities with the microdata, we go from billions into trillions and quadrillions pretty quickly. So the data exercise that we're going to be doing is relatively simple. It's going to be similar in nature to what David was talking about. We're going to be comparing the IPUMS version of the 100% count 1940 census to the synthetic differential privacy versions created by the Census Bureau. We did not run our own code to create our own versions of it. We're working with what was produced. And to keep things simple, we're also focusing on 3 values of epsilon, the lowest 0.25, a middle value of 1, and the highest value that was produced of 8. And we're going to be focusing on 2 different outcomes, both the population counts themselves. Now, it was said that the algorithm is designed to replicate those things, but we wanted to compare them, especially when we look at race, but also the same segregation measure that David looked at, the dissimilarity index, which we're going to be doing somewhat similarly, but I'm going to be presenting it in a slightly different way. And we are especially interested, as you've seen, in how differences for small units of geographies, particularly when we get to county and sub-county levels, how they vary, because, as we've seen, that seems to be where there's a lot of sensitivity. And so before I even talk about the comparisons between the IPUMS 100% count and the differential privacy, I want to talk about what is the official data and what is the ground truth. So the official data that gets released from the 1940 census and the numbers that the Census Bureau put out close to 80 years ago, those are different than the microdata files for which were released by IPUMS and are used as the inputs for differential privacy. No census is perfect. The Census Bureau does as great of a job as it can to assure that, but for a lot of reasons, the microdata counts, all of the enumeration forms that come, there are errors. Sometimes those are innocent errors. Sometimes they're not so innocent errors, and the Census Bureau tries to clean them up. But the 100% counts that IPUMS made available do not necessarily match the official counts by county. And to illustrate that, I have a few maps for you. If you look in the upper left, this is just looking at the log difference in total population by counties between the official version, which is from the National Historical Geographic Information System, which is also produced by IPUMS, and the 100% count, the source files that we've been using today. And I've used a chromatic scale so that white means that the differences are quite small between the two. Blue is indicating that there are more IPUMS 100% count observations than in the official data. Red is the reverse. And you can see if you look in the upper left that overall counts don't look too terrible, but you can definitely see there's more blue in that upper left map, indicating that the 100% count has more people in it than the official numbers. In some cases, that could reflect official undercounts, but it could also reflect that in the 100% microdata counts, there are people included in there that were erroneous and probably should not have been. I'm not taking any stance on which one of those is dominating. I'm just pointing it out. But if you look at the other maps, it also becomes apparent that this problem gets much, much worse when you look at it by race, that their undercounting and overcounting phenomenon can be pretty bad. So one thing to keep in mind is that the microdata that come out are not necessarily what is going to be official. There is no actual truth. Well, maybe the truth is out there, I've been told, but it's not observable. And so when we're talking about the differential privacy numbers that come out, it's not as if we're starting with things that are 100% truthful. It's as close as we can get, but depending on how you count it, there's still error, and we don't know how those two types of error interact. Okay, that being said, you've seen all the differences. What are some of the problems? The data are not perfect, but because the DAS system was applied to the 100% microdata that IPUMS provided, that's the relevant comparison, as David was mentioning. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is we're going to just start off really simple and compare the log population differences between the two different types of data across the different differential privacy runs, across the epsilon values rather, for total population, and then for the white population, and then for the black population. Unlike David, I'm specifically looking at the African American or black population rather than the entire minority population. In 1940, it turns out that that doesn't make a huge difference in most cases, although it does in a few counties. So here's what happens when we look at, again, maps by county, comparing just total population differences across different values of epsilon. If you start off in the lower left and you look at an epsilon of 8, where the privacy budget is pretty generous, you figure there's very little difference. You have a few isolated counties where the population count is off. Those tend to be very small counties. As epsilon gets smaller and privacy gets more demanding on that budget, you start getting more errors. Now, the scale of this is that even if something is really dark red or really dark blue, we're talking about an error of somewhere around 5% in most cases. But still, for a lot of counties, that's showing up when epsilon is really low. This is what happens if we focus on counties that only have a population of 18,000 or more in 1940. That's pretty close to the median that year. And you can see that all of the color on the previous map, most of that is gone now, even as epsilon goes to 0.25. It is a problem in smaller counties in particular, where a small percentage difference is going to be fewer people. You only need relatively few people to be off by to get a larger percentage difference. And so as the asymptotics kick in when you have more people to draw from, this seems to be less of a problem. But this is the total population, regardless of race. What happens if we look specifically at the white population? It looks kind of similar as it did before, but you still see a little bit more color. Even when epsilon is relatively large, you have some overcounts or undercounts in the differential privacy. You're finding fewer whites there relative to the 100% count in IPUMS. In a few counties, particularly in the South, the problem gets much more noticeable, of course, as epsilon decreases. Again, if we look at population, counties with population above 18,000, the larger counties, most of this problem goes away. It is a problem that is highly concentrated in the less populated counties, although you can still see some of it is there in the South, even when epsilon is big. Those are whites. Whites were a very large fraction of the population in 1940. What happens when we shift to blacks? Doesn't look so good. This is what happens for all blacks across all counties. Now, one thing to remember is that most of the counties that are showing up with lots of color here are counties with very few black people in them. And in fact, where you see the least problem is where most of the black population is in the South. But even here, when epsilon is relatively large, you can still see a problem in certain states and counties in the South. It gets much worse, of course, as epsilon goes down. But there are also several counties outside of the South where there is a sizable black population, and we're still seeing relatively large differences of 2% or more in terms of the population. And even if you look at relatively large counties, now these aren't necessarily relatively large counties with the black population, I'll talk about that in a minute, but even in relatively large counties, the problem still persists, including a few counties where the black population is sizable. Now, to give you some numbers about, that was with the graphical representation, but to give you some summary numbers, this is what it looks like in tabular form. And so I've displayed it across different values of epsilon. The first panel is the total population, then you go to the white population and the black population of what is the mean difference, the mean log difference, the standard deviation, and some percentiles. And across all the cases, if you look at the median difference, reassuringly, that is pretty close to 0. It's the tails where there's going to be concern, as always. And so if you look at the mean in terms of total population, even when epsilon is relatively small, the mean error is only 0.2%. Pretty small, and it goes away to pretty much 0 as epsilon gets larger. The tails also truncate and get close to 0 really fast. If we look at the whites, we get a similar phenomenon, although it's not quite as stark. You still see a little bit of lingering differences. It's not quite asymptoting to 0 as quickly, but the problem gets very pronounced, as you saw in the maps with the black population. Even when epsilon is relatively large, the mean county across all counties is off by over 3%. The standard deviation is quite large relative to the previous two, and the tails, the first and 99th percentile, can be off by a very large amount. So another way of thinking about that, and aside from the maps and just saying what are the mean differences, is what share of counties is the population off by less than 1%? If we view that as a target amount of accuracy, what does that look like? And so if you look at the second bullet there, among whites, the share of counties with a population difference between the 100% IPUMS count and the differential privacy, 98.7% of counties are off by less than 1% in the white population when epsilon is 8. That falls to about 81% as epsilon goes to a quarter. It's a pretty big fall, but it's also only a 1% difference. If we look at the black counts across different ways, the problem becomes a little bit more apparent and perhaps of greater concern. The share of counties with differences less than 1% falls from about 2/3 when epsilon is 8 to about a quarter when epsilon is 1/4. So 3/4 of counties are off by a population of at least 1% when epsilon gets really tight. And then if we look at the population above median population counties, those two numbers are 75% and 35%. If we look specifically at counties with above median black populations, if you think that this is entirely an issue because blacks are very sparse in most counties, that helps a little bit, but not entirely. You have 95% are within 1% of the population when epsilon is 8. That goes down to 42% when epsilon is a quarter. And if we restrict it just to the south, we get 86% and 41%. So it tends to be very sensitive to the minority population, to epsilon, and to small counties. So this is the dissimilarity index that David talked about. It has an intuitive interpretation. It's the fraction of people that you need to move from one sub-geographic unit to another in order to equalize the population in the shares in the larger geographic unit. We're going to be doing this very similar to the way that David was doing it, except we're looking at whites and blacks specifically rather than whites and minorities. This is popularly used because it's easy to understand and easy to calculate, and a lot of the measures that are looking at segregation use this measure. It turns out that this measure has a lot of problems which are known, but it's used anyway. But the index turns out to be very sensitive to small changes in the tails, as David mentioned. And if there's measurement error, that compounds the problem. And so one of the key problems is that if you have a 0/0 issue because you have a completely homogeneous county, the way that the index doesn't fall apart through an undefinition is that a 0/0 gets treated as 1. So if you have a completely a completely homogeneous county with one of the groups, the DI is set to be 0. If you have one person of the other group move into that county, the DI can get very close to 1, just from that one person. So any sort of algorithm change for differential privacy where you fuzzify one person in the data makes this measure really, really sensitive to that. And similarly, if you have a perfectly segregated county where all of the groups live in one of the subunits and everyone else lives in the other subunits, misreporting even one person across those subunits can also create downward bias in the index. So it happens to be very sensitive. But it's used, and people naively are going to use it. And so knowing what's going to happen is pretty important. And so what I'm showing you here are histograms of the DI calculated within enumeration districts for a county. So each observation underlying these histograms is the DI for a county. The tan-colored ones are for the IPUMS 100% count. The blue bars underlying them are for the differential privacy. And you can look at the different runs across the columns, but not much is going on there. Really, I want you to pay attention to what happens as you move across the rows. If we look at the first row at the top there, you see that the differential privacy version, when epsilon is a quarter, you find more mass in the tails particularly, where that's relevant to the bias that I was just talking about, how it's very easy to move things to 1 or have downward bias depending on if you move just one person when it's that sensitive. So as epsilon is a quarter, you're finding more mass in the tails of the differential of the dissimilarity index than in the middle relative to the IPUMS ground truth. As epsilon gets larger, we might think the asymptotics kick in and the two histograms are going to converge in distribution. It turns out that's not the case. Even as you go down to epsilon is equal to 8, there is more mass in the differential privacy version in the middle of the distribution and less in the tails, particularly a lot less at 0. We're finding less dispersion in the dissimilarity index under the differential privacy data, even under a relatively large epsilon, than relative to the 100% IPUMS count. You might say that's being driven again by certain small counties. You're not entirely wrong. But this is what happens when we look at below median population counties. The tail problem for small epsilon is really apparent here. And as you go away, as you go to a larger epsilon, you don't see as much mass moving to the center here. You see the mass moving disproportionately up. There's an upward bias in the dissimilarity index for low population counties, even under a relatively large epsilon. If we look at above median population counties, this is where we see the bias shrinking the dispersion to be particularly apparent. Here, even when epsilon is low, you're not seeing so much bias in the tails, you're seeing more in the middle. That continues to get more prominent as epsilon goes up. We are not finding that sort of convergence. And so here you can see the same thing in tabular format. Basically, the things that I want you to pay attention to here is that the standard deviation of that dissimilarity index is overshooting. For low epsilon, it's bigger than the IPUMS number, but even as epsilon increases, it then gets smaller and perhaps could continue to grow smaller even if epsilon were to go past 8. And so I also want to show you what that looks like graphically here. These are the dissimilarity differences for IPUMS, again, for differential privacy. For all the counties, you can see where the blue is where IPUMS is going to have a larger index relative to the differential privacy one. You can see that that's very large outside of the South. That's where all the color is. But what happens as we increase the population? Here's if we restrict it to counties with at least 10,000 population. That's roughly the 25th percentile in total population. Here's what happens as we go to counties with above the median. You can see that the problem is not so apparent in the South, but is still rather apparent in certain northern counties where they're off by quite a lot. And here's what happens when you do the mean. That's not as interesting. It turns out only about 10% of counties had above 40,000 population in 1940. But this is the one that I actually want to focus on. Again, because most blacks in 1940 lived in the South, we should pay attention to what's going on in the South. And so if you look in the lower right, this has a different scale than the previous graphs I showed you. It's much finer. So things that appeared not to be a problem before, as we zoom in and make the scale finer, can become more apparent. So you can see that if you look at the lower right, there's still a lot of variation in terms of the dissimilarity index if we go by the 100% IPUMS count. There's a lot of variation across those places. What happens when you look at the differences between the IPUMS and the differential privacy in the other three graphs? Well, if epsilon is really big, it doesn't seem to be much of a problem in most of the Deep South, but we do find problems in Texas, we find problems in Missouri, and we find, I know Missouri is not technically the South according to census definitions, but it was a slave state, so we're including it, as well as Appalachia. That's where we seem to find the biggest variances, even when epsilon is relatively large. As epsilon shrinks, those problems become more apparent in more places. And when epsilon is a corridor, even in the South, you actually see quite a few places where the dissimilarity index is off by 5 percentage points or more. So just to wrap up, what we've basically shown is that the effects of differential privacy on census data in practice are still not that well understood. And this is just scratching the surface among one dimension. The total population counts reassuringly, and as we've seen from previous presenters, those do tend to converge to the IPUMS numbers, especially as epsilon goes to infinity, but this is less true for the black population, and it's probably less true for other minority or other small shares of population. But one of the other takeaways is that the commonly used measures of segregation can be very sensitive to differential privacy because they're very sensitive to measurement error. So a lot of the applied statistics that people in practice calculate that aren't necessarily the things that census puts out or is designing differential privacy to put out could be at risk, and we just don't know that yet. The problems generally get worse in smaller and more rural areas. That is pretty common across all three of the presentations. I've mentioned that this is, we just know this is impacting for race and age. We don't know for how impactful it's going to be for many of the other outcomes or fields or variables that we collect, including income, education, age, many other things. More generally, statistics that tend to be very sensitive to data accuracy. We don't know what the implication for that is going to be going forward under differential privacy. We may need more robust statistics. And even if we have robust statistics, we don't know if they're going to be appropriate to use in small areas going forward. There may be a data quality issue that we can't quite resolve with the statistics that we have in place now. And with that, I'll wrap up, so thank you.